You've all been notified. Good evening. Good evening. It's so good to see you all here, and welcome. What I had planned to do with this particular session is really do an overview, kind of a survey. And we're going to start tonight with a little bit of an overview of iconography and icons, and what they are, a little on their history, a little bit about the symbolism that you see in them. I think we've all at some point seen an icon somewhere, or we have some. We might have bought some that just spoke to us. But they all have some similar styles, similar colorings, and similar features that actually have theological underpinnings. So we're going to get into that a little bit tonight to kind of get you started on reading icons for yourself. Because as you read an icon, you start to enter into the world of that icon. And the theology behind icons that comes to us from the Eastern Church is that they make present what is depicted in the image. So what's happened is you're entering God's time, that time where, time really stands still, past and present all collapse into right now. And that which is depicted, whether it's the Nativity or the crucifixion or the resurrection, all of those it's bringing that into the present reality right now to meet you right here. And so what we're going to do is take a look at one icon of the Nativity and kind of introduce you to the various characters from the story and the ways that they are depicted in icons. And then what I thought we would do in the second and third sessions is to unpack the Matthew story and the Luke story. Because during Christmas, our lectionary sort of smooshes it all together. And how many of us have nativity sets in their home, right? And you've got the angels over here and the shepherds, and then we've got the wise guys over here. And so what we have is this mashup of Matthew and Luke, but they tell two very, very different stories. The nativity icon also, like a nativity set, brings both of those stories together, along with some tradition and with some narrative that is not in the Bible. So we're going to kind of take a look at all of those pieces and read this icon, and also take a look at some adjunct icons that have to do either with the Matthew story or the Luke story. Sound good? Okay, so what I'll do, I'm going to go ahead and get this presentation up on screen. And here we go. Can you all see that? All right, cool. I'll move some things around here to make it a little bit easier. Okay, so let's begin. Let's take a look at a little brief history of icons and iconography. Brief history is really brief. Over here, we have depicted Saint Luke, and he is painting an icon of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus, being guided by the hand of an angel behind him. It's there's a number of depictions on this. But it is said that St. Luke was the first iconographer, the very first iconographer. So there is this wonderful tradition that because he was an eyewitness and that he knew the Virgin Mary, or as she is known in Greek, Theotokos, meaning the God bearer, that he brought the paintings of her to be blessed by her, and that she blessed them and prayed that those who would see these images would draw closer to her son, Jesus. So we have this tradition that Luke actually created a number of icons of the Virgin Mary, some of them very, very famous. And it's really holy tradition. Can we prove any of this? Of course not. But we do have this tradition that this started very early. Now, what happened was that there was some economic incentive around iconography, that when the Emperor Constantine became a Christian, he eliminated all Roman taxation on religious art. So this kind of opened up the world to create these images for the church. And so the early Byzantine Empire under Justinian the Great is really when iconography became very well developed. It became widespread, and a certain canon developed, a certain standardization for the depictions of various people. So we see some things that once we get to know who the cast of characters are and what kind of depictions and colors and positioning of hands and whatnot, you can pretty well tell who's being depicted without having to read Greek or Slavonic script. But of course, this all led to controversies. There was a period known as the Iconoclasm Controversies. And iconoclasm means icon smashers, literally. And there were people that arose and did not like the use of icons. This is an icon of the Virgin Mary, of course, with Christ. And this happened around the 7th and 8th centuries. So we have two groups, the iconoclastics, who are icon smashers, who are led by the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were a group of Christians who it was deemed heretical, but every heresy comes around from time to time. And Gnosticism saw all material things as evil. Okay, so if it was made of the material world is bad, and the spiritual world is good. So we have this dualistic thinking in Gnosticism. And they saw these because they were made of physical material, physical matter, that they would have been bad or evil. You also at the same time had the rise of Islam. And the rise of Islam did not promote the veneration of human images. In fact, Islamic art generally is around their wonderful calligraphy and script and geometric patterns, but not of human figures. It's been said that there are no depictions of Muhammad. It's not entirely true. In the 12th century, there were some depictions. However, he is dressed in a burqa and you cannot see his face. So there you go. The idea of putting a human face and putting especially a human face on God. They believe Jesus to be a prophet, but not divine. And so this is the break with Christianity. So now you have this group of iconoclastics who want to smash icons and get rid of them. And then you have the iconodules, who are the icon venerators, and they vigorously defended the use of icons. One of them who's very prominent is St. John of Damascus. Now, if you take a good look at this icon of the Virgin Mary, you see she has 3 hands. Now, I'm a mom, have a couple of kids. I would have loved to have had a 3rd hand. But this is a rather interesting legend, and it is a legend, that St. John of Damascus was also an iconographer, and he also worked for the Islamic Caliph. And the Caliph told him to stop writing icons. So what happened was that he refused. He refused to stop, and he ended up having his hand cut off by the Caliph. Yeah, so the tradition holds he had his icon writing hand gets cut off, and he grabbed the hand and he pushed it against the stump, and he had a vision of the Virgin Mary who said that he would be healed completely, and he was miraculously healed. His hand was restored. So in thanksgiving for having his hand restored, he put this little silver hand onto the bottom of the icon of the Virgin Mary. And so she became kind of known as Mary of 3 hands, because in later depictions of that, later iconographers copying his icon ended up just incorporating the hand. So this is one of the more unusual icons of Virgin Mary, Mary with 3 hands. Finally, the iconodule position was supported by the Ecumenical Council in Nicaea. Now, this was the late one in 787. It was the last of the ecumenical councils that upheld the iconodule position, that icons were just fine. It was all right to venerate icons. That's not worshiping. Veneration is showing respect, but it is not worship. And it's not idolatry, that icons are a tool or a window through which we see the deeper spiritual reality, and that because they're made of material things, well, our Lord was a human being. He was a material person that was flesh and blood. So the physicality of the icons was really no barrier to authentic Christian faith. Now here we have good old St. Nicholas. He sure doesn't look like Santa Claus, does he? This is a very beloved icon in the Near East, St. Nicholas of Myra. Myra is mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Acts. It was a port city, and he was the bishop of Myra. And so I love being in the Episcopal Church because I can say, yes, Santa Claus was a real guy and tell the story of Santa Claus. So this is Nicholas. He is depicted in his bishop's robes. He's wearing the pallium or the omophoron here around his neck. And he is also depicted in a very stylized way. We'll talk about that stylization in a moment. But the purpose of icons, they are anagogic. They bring this reality to us. They lift our spirit, and lift, ana means to lift up, gogic, our eye, the vision. So it is to lift our vision out of the ordinary. They depict the spiritual realities of subjects. They're not realistic. If you look at them, you'll see that the proportions are not intended to be realistic at all. You can see Nicholas's head is rather large. He's got a really big forehead. This is depicting his wisdom. He's a very wise person. So wise people have big heads. They also tend to have very large hands and large eyes and ears as far as relative proportions. So what they're depicting is the spiritual reality of that person and their life. We're depicting them as they are in eternity among the communion of saints. They are meant to teach the faith without words. Icons were meant to be working with non-literate folks. So they were ways of teaching the faith. And because of that, faithful rendering is faithful teaching. Okay, so faithfully rendering an icon to project the spiritual truth of that which is depicted is really important so that people learn the truth of the faith. There's an importance of following this teaching, and originality is not really a value when it comes to iconography. Icons are a form of prayer, not only for the person looking at the icon, but for the iconographer themselves. Praying and fasting are very common practices for iconographers, and spiritual fasting as well as physical fasting. Talk a little bit about the stylization that you'll see inside of iconography. This is actually a Western icon of St. Francis of Assisi, telling us a little bit about who he was. He's wearing his Franciscan habit. You can see the stigmata, the nail prints that he was said to have had, the wounds of Christ in his hands and in his feet. And he's out among nature with all of the animals, which we know him for. As I mentioned, originality is not a value. Coming up with some new hot take in iconography is not looked upon very well, because again, faithful rendering is faithful teaching. So copying faithfully, sometimes there's little variations, but there are some standardizations. These archetypes are fixed. They only have very minor variations. If you see St. Francis depicted, even in a Western icon, you'll see him depicted in his monk's habit. You don't see him depicted in anything else. He'll be in a brown monk's habit. The bodily features, things to keep in mind when you look at an icon. You'll see that the images have enlarged eyes, ears, and hands. Okay, so the eyes to see, the ears to hear, the hands of being Christ, if you will, is the hands are the instrument of doing. Most icons really have tiny mouths. You know, sometimes they're so tiny and a beard's covering them. If it's a man, that you almost don't see the mouth. They're very, very small. They're not there to speak. They're there to listen and listen to those who are praying with them. They have long, slender noses. And then you'll see, like Francis here is a little bit bent over. Sometimes you'll see these, they'll be depicted to the side and just a little bit bent over. And that is the weight of glory that they are carrying. You'll see trees and mountains and buildings in some icons, and they're very, very stylized. If you look at that mountain behind Francis, I mean, we know it's a mountain, but I don't know about you, but I've never seen mountains that really look like that. And if you look at the trees around him, they almost have said a Dr. Seuss kind of quality to them. They're not very realistic, but you know it's a tree. So there is a stylization that goes along with trees and buildings and mountains. Animals, they often have very human-like features. If you look at the eyes of these animals, sometimes the faces look a little bit human. I think the horse kind of there under the tree has almost a smile on its face. So oftentimes animals will have kind of an anthropomorphic or human-like look to them. This is an icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. Other stylization things you'll see is that clothing has folds that are geometric forms that are symbolic of the cosmic order. So things like triangles symbolize the Holy Trinity. If you look at Mary's robe here, you can kind of look at it closely and see that there are some triangles involved in the folds of her robe. You'll see ovals, oftentimes with the thigh or the shoulder will have an oval worked into it, and that's for eternity. Rectangles show up from time to time. You have the 4 Gospels, the 4 evangelists. And you also have some standardization of color. Blue represents the eternal nature of God. So eternity, the majesty and transcendence of God is often represented with blue. Red, humanity and our blood. So you see that Mary is often depicted with a red garment, not 100%. You know, for every rule there is in iconography, there's something that will break the rule. So there is the occasional image of Mary wearing a blue robe, which is more common in Western depictions of her. But in the Eastern depictions, the red robe is more common. Green, the green color is the regeneration, the Holy Spirit. You'll often see prophets depicted in green. We see a little bit of a green color here with Mary. It's kind of a blued green, and same with Jesus in his robes. White is the resurrection. It's also the glory of God and of purity. Gold is also the glory of God. Purple and crimson. These are signs of God's reign. These are the, if you will, the regal or the royal colors. The color black can be depicted both as death, also as evil. And evil occasionally is depicted in icons. And brown, the earth and perishability. Now there's one color you will not see in icons, and that is gray. because gray is between white and black, and there really is no in-between space between resurrection and death. It's one or the other. It's not both. So you won't see the color gray depicted in icons. All right, before we go into our nativity stories, wanted to check in and see if there were any questions or wonderings. I'm kind of cruising through to check on folks. Everybody doing all right? Okay. All right, so let's talk about our nativity stories. We're going to talk about the cast of characters. The two nativity stories do not match up. Don't try to harmonize them. We tell them all at Christmas. Matthew tells a very different story from Luke. Mark, well, he's silent. Nothing in Mark about the origins of Jesus. It is thought by scholars that Mark's gospel was the first gospel. It really is the simplest. It's the most Spartan. It's the beginning of the good news of of Jesus Christ, Son of God. John the Baptist shows up in the wilderness and he's baptizing. I mean, it's like you just jump into the action. And Mark is also the gospel that leaves us wondering at the very end, because the women show up at an empty tomb. They're told that they're going to Galilee. Jesus will meet you there, and go and tell everybody. And they all run away terrified and say nothing to anybody because they were afraid. And that's where the gospel leaves you. So Mark jumps into the action right away. And the Christian faith at this point is beginning to really move around, and it's really beginning to grow thanks to the missionary journeys of Paul and his companions. Paul's writings are the earliest writings. These letters are beginning to get circulated throughout the churches, and Christianity is on the move. So what's happening is the eyewitnesses are dying out, and there's a concern about passing on the faith. And this is where the impetus for writing the Gospels comes from. So Mark just gets right in there and tells about all the action going on. Well, if you're going to discredit a movement, and I mean, from the Roman perspective, Jesus was a criminal. He was executed, and in the eyes of Rome, executed justly. So if you want to discredit a movement, one of the best ways to do it is to discredit the leader. Discrediting the leader is a really good way to start knocking down the movement, right? So one of the ways you discredit a leader is you question their origins, or you question their credibility. Who does this guy think he is? So in the ancient world, and it still happens even in our modern world, is the question of your origins being not so legitimate. Like, who was Jesus's real daddy? And so questions about his origins come up. Who's this? Where's this guy really from? What's his credibility? And that's where the answer to that question comes up for Matthew and for Luke. All right, so they're telling a story, each of them, to establish Jesus's connection to the house of David. That's really their primary concern, is to establish Jesus's legitimacy as Son of God. Now, the method of doing that, of claiming that Mary is miraculously impregnated by the Holy Spirit, is not an uncommon literary device in the Greco-Roman world. It was said of Aristotle, of Socrates, of Plato, of all the great philosophers. They had Zeus as their father and an earthly mother. So this was a very common literary device that would have been understood in the Roman Empire, of Mary becoming miraculously pregnant by God and giving birth to this special child. And that's what both Matthew and Luke are doing, but they're doing it for two different audiences. Luke has a focus on Mary and establishes the Davidic line connected through Mary and her family. It's a very thick narrative, and it's probably the longer one and the most familiar one to us. He's primarily writing for a Gentile audience. Luke writes in the style of Homer. If you've ever read the Iliad and the Odyssey, ever had to read that in high school? If you've read these great Roman mythological adventure stories, Jason and the Argonauts, and those, if you've read that, then go back and read Luke and his second book, Acts, and they do read like a Greco-Roman adventure story. So he really wants the known world to learn about this Jesus guy and to tell the good news. Matthew, however, focuses on Joseph and establishing the Davidic line through his family. And his focus is a Jewish audience. He wants to show Jesus as the fulfillment of the prophesied Messiah. So it's a fulfillment of prophecy. John, well, we get poetry with John. John's off doing his own thing. I preached at All Saints about how John, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the Beatles, right? And John's kind of the Ringo of the gospel writers. He's just off doing his own thing, and he's doing something completely different. So his prologue talks about Jesus as the Word who became flesh and dwelt among us, but that really doesn't have any narrative as far as his origins and his birth. So we're going to focus on Luke and Matthew. So let's take a look at the cast of characters. Needless to say, John the Baptist is going to show up in both stories. John is also known in Eastern churches as the forerunner. Icons of John will generally show him, he's often bent over, he's often pointing to Jesus, especially if it's in a diptych or triptych, and has bad hair. He pretty much has bad hair and looks like a wild man. He's dressed in green garments. Remember, we said that was the Holy Spirit, right? And his kind of wild look is pretty typical of the prophets. Another one here of John. Here's John holding his own head. Kind of an odd depiction of him, but it's not an unusual depiction. And one of the things you'll notice is that saints who often meet a violent death, sometimes they'll be holding the instrument of their death. Paul is often depicted holding a sword because tradition holds that he was beheaded in Rome. Here we have John holding his own head on a platter, and he has wings, which I've had people ask, why wings? Well, one of the images of one who brings good news, an angel, is that they have wings. So it really says that John is a messenger, and that's what wings are depicting, is the messenger status that he has. He's holding a wand or a staff, that is a symbol of authority. And he is holding a scroll. Often it's one of the quotes that he has about preparing the way. So it's either a quote from Isaiah or a quote from John the Baptist himself. Again, he's depicted in the green robes, and this one actually has him also depicted with the camel's hair undergarment. Still has bad hair though. Mary, also known as Theotokos, which means the God bearer. This is actually a later one of Mary with her veil. And Mary is most often depicted with Jesus in some way. This is the focus here is on Mary. And if you look at the top, there's the Christ child pronouncing blessing on her. So you'll see her robes are red outer garment or a crimson outer garment depicting her humanity. And her inner garment is blue because her humanity enfolds the divinity of God within her as the God bearer. Then we get Gabriel. His name means strong man of God. The archangels, Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael, are often depicted together. Sometimes you'll see a diptych of Gabriel and Michael. And they are also holding staffs. So there's a symbol of authority. They have their wings, so they are messengers. And his holy garments are kind of a brownish purple. Okay, that is kind of a deep brownish purple. He's got some blue on that sleeve there. You have the gold, so you have the glory of God being depicted. And often the archangels will be holding an orb, and inside the orb is the letter Chi, looks like an X, and that stands, of course, for Christ. Then we have Joseph. Now, in Eastern iconography, Joseph is kind of a background character. He's not really the main character of the story. Mary is the main character giving birth to the Christ. But occasionally you see icons of Joseph being depicted. Here he's carrying Jesus on his shoulders. When I was in the Holy Land, gosh, it's coming up on 3 years ago, there is a wonderful Orthodox church in Nazareth. And it was said to be the place where the Annunciation happened. And there are just, icons all over the walls. And there is an icon of them returning from Egypt. And Joseph is carrying Jesus on his shoulders. And you can just imagine that, if you're a parent, you got a kid, little guys love to be up on your shoulders so they can see what's going on. It really kind of brings a human side to Jesus. Then we have Elizabeth and Zechariah, and they are featured in Luke's gospel. And of course, we have John the Forerunner too in the picture. We see Elizabeth, who is very old, and she was said to be barren, and she is holding John. And Zechariah, he is being depicted in his priestly robes as he served in the temple. And then, of course, we have shepherds. You can't get away from a nativity story without shepherds. And we have the shepherds are really Luke's witnesses. This is a Coptic icon, and this is a little bit different style out of North Africa. Often Coptic icons have very childlike faces, and so they're very rounded. And many of the faces will look like almost like you had a stamp and you stamped them because they're so similar to each other. And we have the adoration of the shepherds going on here with the angels over the top of them. Then from Matthew, he has a different set of witnesses to the event, and they are the Magi or Magoi, which in Greek means wise people. It is not necessarily wise men, although that's how we've traditionally translated this. The Magi came from the East, and they came bearing gifts. Here is another Coptic icon depicting this. In the foreground, they have their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And in the background here, in this nativity icon, you see the shepherds, and they're looking up at the angels announcing the birth of Christ. The ox and the ass. Now, we know this from the old Christmas hymn, In Dulce Jubilo, right? The ox and ass before him bow, and he is in the manger now, right? We've heard that Christmas carol. This is holy tradition. It's not in the story, but in every nativity icon, you will see the ox and the ass. And if you have a nativity set in your home, you probably have one. that has these figures. They are depicting something deeper, though. They are depicting Jews and Gentiles coming together. The ox is a kosher animal. The ass is not a kosher animal, and in fact is kind of wild. And even St. Paul talked about the Gentiles being wild olive shoots grafted into the branch, grafted into the root of Judaism. So this is where we see just this subtle depiction of the vision that Jesus would be the one to reconcile Jews and Gentiles. And here we have a depiction of Mary. This is a kind of a tight shot. And you'll notice that Jesus is laying in a manger that looks like a sarcophagus. That's intentional. He's also wrapped, almost like a mummy, in the swaddling clothes. And Satan. This was not part of the story in Luke or Matthew. And it's kind of like a, wait, how did he show up here? But Holy Tradition has that Joseph had some doubts. Everyone was singing, "What child is this?" And Joseph wanted to know whose child was this. So here we have Joseph, and we'll see him in the larger nativity depiction, sort of sitting there with a little bit of a troubled look on his face. And there's this other figure talking to him. Now, one thing about icons is the way they depict faces. It'll either be the full face or maybe a little side view, but you will always see both eyes of a holy person. If it's a holy person, you will always see both eyes. You'll notice this other figure is in profile. There are only two figures in iconography that are ever shown in profile. One is Satan, the other is Judas Iscariot, if he's depicted. So this clearly can't be Judas Iscariot. So yes, it's Satan putting doubts into the heart of Joseph about Jesus. So this comes from the Holy Tradition, and partly, probably a very early tradition of the doubts about Jesus's origins. So now we get to the whole icon. There's a lot going on here. The icon combines the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, both telling their story, the Proto-Evangelium of James, a book that did not get into the Bible, but is part of early Christian writings, and has some narratives about the birth of Christ that differ from Matthew and Luke. One of which is that he was born in a cave, not in a wooden stable. I wouldn't buy the wooden stable anyway, having been to Bethlehem. There's not a lot of wood other than olive wood and fruit trees. So, you know, the cave is a little more plausible because people actually lived in carved out caves. That's, you know, when you're living in a hot environment, you live in a cave, it gets cooler in there. So a lot of homes were actually carved out of the side of mountains. So there were spaces that, you know, you can go inside and get cooled off. So the idea of him being born in a cave on the way to Bethlehem, according to the Proto-Evangelium, it's not an outrageous thing. Is that it was probably more like a cave than it was like a wooden house. And then some of this depiction comes from Holy Tradition too. So let's take a look. Starting at the very top, there is this kind of half circle. And this is a depiction of the glory of God and the Holy Spirit coming down and of course touching the Christ child, who is also again laying in a sarcophagus, wrapped up in his swaddling clothes. We have our angels at the top. And on the left, we have the depiction of the Magi who are on the journey to come see the Christ child. On the right, we have the shepherds and the angel up there, you know, with a hand raised in blessing, probably saying, don't be afraid. You shouldn't be afraid of the angel, right? But they're kind of taken back in fear. You can see they're a little, their posture there is a little bit shocked. And of course, they have their lambs. And then we have another little shepherd boy just below that, kind of playing his trumpet. And then down below him, we have two midwives with the Christ child. They're going to wash him. It is a reminder that Jesus had a normal birth, just like you and me. And I have two kids. I've given birth twice. It's a messy process, right? So he needed to be washed just like our babies needed to be washed once they were born. So the midwives are there to give him his first bath. We have, as we move across the lower left-hand side, there's Joseph having the seeds of doubt about Jesus's origins being put into his heart by Satan. And in the middle of the picture, of course, with Jesus, we have the ox and the ass inside the cave. And we have Mary reclining after giving birth. Now notice she's not looking at Jesus. She's looking down towards Joseph and praying for him as he is being tempted by Satan. So we have this combination picture, this image that has a lot going on in it, bringing all of these different elements together. And it's to give us that spiritual reality of a kind of a complicated picture, isn't it? It's not a simple story. There's a lot of layers to it. And Matthew and Luke certainly have their different tellings on that. So I want to open this up and see, are there any comments, thoughts, questions? I'll leave this image up on the screen. And I'll just let you unmute yourself.
So Mother Anjel, in Japanese pictures, they are stamped when, you know, they've been approved or someone says they like them. The Greek letters, and there aren't very many on this icon you have on the screen right now, but the Greek, well, beside to the left of Mary's halo.
Yes, yes.
What are those all about?
What are those letters about? That's a great question. The lettering on an icon is telling you who's in the icon. Now, the iconographers actually use abbreviations. So if you look at the letters next to Jesus's head, it looks like an I and a C with a little squiggly over the top, and an X and a C with a squiggly over the top. The C is actually the letter sigma. So it's the first letter of iota, and sigma is Jesus. You just drop all the middle letters out. So that squiggly means, you know, put that together. So it's an abbreviation. So the I and the iota and the sigma is Jesus, and the chi and the sigma is Christ. So when you see that, you see it's Jesus Christ. To the left of Mary, it's again an abbreviation for Marion Theon. And so it is the Mary, Mother of God. So that's what the Greek letters here mean. You'll also notice if you look at Jesus's halo, and we'll see this in next week as we start to look at some of the other icons. In Jesus's halo, there are 3 Greek letters. And what they are a shorthand for is the being. If you recall, the Gospel of John, and this is where they kind of bring a little of Johannine theology in. In the Gospel of John, we have the I am statements. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the gate. I am the vine. You are the branches, right? All of those are I am statements. And when John wrote that, what he was trying to get at for the Jewish hearers was to take their minds and their imaginations back to the burning bush on Sinai. When Moses said to that voice coming out of the burning bush, when I go to Pharaoh, he's going to ask what or I go back to my people, they're going to want to know what your name is. What's your name? And what does the bush say? I am that I am. So I am is my name. And so that is the self-revelation of God. So the letters in his halo is the being or the I am. So that Jesus is associated with God. So it's what we call a high Christology, that Jesus is human, but he is also divine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to my picture, but I'm glad you can still hear me.
I can still hear you just fine.
I noticed that the wise men are on horses. They're not on camels.
Yeah.
And all the crash scenes have camels for the wise men.
Exactly. Yeah, that is kind of an odd thing, isn't it? They're all on horses, and it seemed to be always depicted on horses. I have seen a few Western icons that depict camels. You're right. Camels were probably more logically what they were going to be riding. But one of the things about the depictions of the Magi is that they are foreigners. They're also often depicted wearing pants. In the 4th century mosaics in the Church of the Holy Nativity in Bethlehem, they are depicted as wearing turbans and pants. And in the 4th century, this church was built under Constantine, and of course his mother was on a big building spree. And when the Ottoman Turks, when the Muslims took over Jerusalem, they had something called the status quo, which said to other believers, to Christians, to Jews, you can worship God in the way you see fit, but don't ever rebel against our leadership or we'll destroy you. Well, then we did this thing called the Crusades, which is a part of a long history of outsiders going to the Holy Land thinking they have all the answers. And so when the Crusades swept in, the retaliation by the Muslim Caliph was to destroy the Christian churches, except for one, the Church of the Holy Nativity in Bethlehem, because Jesus is the greatest prophet in Islam. So when they came into that church and they looked up and saw these mosaics, and there's 3 guys, they're wearing pants and they're wearing turbans and they look like us, and they realized from their own Quran, oh wait, this is the space that is for Miriam and Jesus. Miriam and Isa, this is a holy site even for Muslims. That's the only 4th century church they did not destroy. Any other questions, thoughts, curiosities from icons that maybe you have encountered? Go ahead and stop the share here. There we go.
I was interested in your last comments about the Church of the Nativity not being destroyed. Were there images of Mary and Christ there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the Muslims did not obscure those?
Nope. They left them alone, just kind of backed out. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting that
That's
did not.
Unusual.
Yeah, it is unusual, but they realized where they were and went, woo, pulled back and just did not destroy that church.
The other church that I think of, very famous, Saint Sophia in Istanbul.
Yes.
They covered up all of those images.
Mm-hmm.
They did not destroy, and a lot of them were uncovered and maybe recovered now. But depiction of a human being was not allowed.
Right. They were concerned that people would worship that, would worship the image. And, this is where we differ. I think when you get into living in the Middle East, they have been such a pluralistic society for so long. And of course, have had the wars back and forth and such, that the situation there is far more complicated than we often make it out to be from our vantage point here in the United States. We get fed pieces, and really the history is a little more complex and nuanced than we would otherwise be able to understand.
So what I said is more like a taboo that, well, now let's see.
Yeah, they backed out. Now later, those icons and those mosaics were covered, and now they're in the process of uncovering them. And when they were covered is kind of shrouded in mystery, but they're in the process. Archaeologists and preservationists are uncovering all of these mosaics that were in the church and covered up for many years. And it's just stunning, the colors. And a lot of the principles and depictions that we see in Eastern and Byzantine iconography, those depictions, you see them echoed in the mosaics, in the colors that are used. So this history of using certain colors for certain things, the red, the blues, the greens, actually is pretty deep tradition, going all the way back to Roman times. Other questions and thoughts? All right.
Why is the style seems to be very flat, except the robes have dimension to them in the folds on the robes.
Right.
But the icons, they've always struck me as having sort of a flat face or appearance. I'm just mistaken, I guess. I don't know.
Well, they are very stylized in how they're depicted, but they're not depicted realistically. So we're not going for the same kind of dimensions, but they are kind of brought up from a very flat background. When you see an icon painted, we actually start out with an outline, and you fill in with what is called the protoplasmos. That's the first layer of color, is called protoplasm. So you're coming out of the disorganized chaos of protoplasm, and then layering on highlights that start to bring the image up off the board towards you. So you're working from chaos to order, right? The darker colors to the lighter colors. And so the faces will be usually in what are called a dynamic pose. You normally don't see a straight on face. It'll be turned slightly, often just turned just a little bit, and then the eyes will go the opposite direction. So if the face is turned this way, the eyes will look this way, and that's how you get that Mona Lisa. No matter where you stand, the eyes follow you. That dynamic construct was actually known back in Roman times. If you go to the city of Sepphoris, which is an archaeological site, it was likely the place where Jesus learned how to do not carpentry, but stone cutting. There's very little wood in that section of Galilee. It's mostly the constructions are stone constructions. There's very, very little wood. So Jesus was more likely a stone cutter. He was a teknon, and we've translated that word as carpenter. So we have this image, but it's largely born out of a Western European imagination, not a Middle Eastern one. And it's likely that Jesus and Joseph worked in Sepphoris, which was called the Jewel of the Galilee. It was this, huge cosmopolitan city. And they're continuing to uncover the ancient city of Sepphoris, and there are mosaics in the floors of these, very wealthy Roman houses. And the same principles where you'll have the head turned slightly and the eyes looking this way. And then that dynamic, it's when they call the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, and you move around the room and your eyes follow you. It's the same principles. And many icons are constructed that way, so that as you move, the icon is still looking at you. Any other thoughts or observations? All right. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Next week will be a little more interactive. I wanted to kind of give you that background and how to read these things. If you start seeing icons, if you see some this week, as you look around, and whether online or you see them, at church, take a look, see if you can pick out the characters based on some of the colors and styles that you saw tonight. They may be of saints you haven't seen before. So sometimes they take a little bit of interpretation. Some of the script, as Connie pointed out, what are all those letters? Well, sometimes it's actually the stylized letters that say like St. John or St. Luke. Sometimes they're in English, sometimes they're in Greek, sometimes they're in Russian or Slavonic script, which can get a little tricky to pick out. But some of the more common characters from our nativity story show up here and there in various icons, and see if you can figure out who they are. And if you find some that you're just like, who is this guy? Feel free to bring them next week, and we'll take a look at them. All right.
Very good.
Very good. Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and stop the record. Let's see. I can stop the live stream, and we'll stop